can you make something become more true to itself by scraping away everything and rebuilding it completely differently from the ground up with entirely new components? Is it a ghost of its former self? There is a debate within the Resident Evil fan community about what the most important components of a Resident Evil game are. What is it that makes the franchise tick? The original games feature claustrophobic locations. They have a strong focus on item management and shock horror. With each entry, the game seemed to increase in scope as it developed its own internal lore. It was always based off a series of cheap B-movie tropes, but it lent into that melodrama. Resident Evil 4 changes everything, switching from the third-person tank controls to an over-the-shoulder action shooter that emphasises the action and combat. Whilst the first 3 games excelled in their sense of isolation, the next 3 games became increasingly frantic in the search for a way to combine this action horror concept with big budget blockbuster sensibilities. By Resident Evil 6, the behemoth was sleek, polished and, for some people, slightly soulless compared to the first 3 games of the franchise. I would hesitate to call Resident Evil 6 a failure. The game certainly has its fans, and it did sell well over 10 million copies eventually, but Capcom admitted that it was still a disappointment as it took more than twice as long to reach this goal as they'd anticipated. They had allowed the scope of the game to balloon, making it their largest ever production at the time, with more than 600 development staff working on the game. 10 million sales was far more than any other Resident Evil game had ever sold before. Yet still, Capcom needed more to justify their investment. Utterly average review scores on Metacritic, and some profit, just not enough, which led to a combination of revolting shareholders at the top of the business criticising the seemingly lacklustre performance of their AAA franchise, and a critical backlash from both fans and critics who perceived the series of losing focus meant that in 2013, for a moment, it felt like this might be the end of the franchise. A grand folly killed by its own ambition. Had we been paying attention, we would have had proof all the way back in 2015 that Capcom wasn't going to walk away from this franchise that easily, that it still had a lot of faith in the concept. They were savvy enough to realise the division within their fanbase, and they wanted to take some time to ensure that the next game in the series, one that would follow 2 very distinct trilogies, would find a way to connect the dots and satisfy everyone. Internal discussions in Capcom as far back as 2014 had directed them to head back to their survival horror roots and the development of a brand new custom game engine, the RE engine. The decision to move to first person came first, that the game should be virtual reality enabled came second, but it was a happy evolution of the concept that came with its own benefits. Ensuring that the game would be suitable for the intense, very personal perspective that would be demanded by virtual reality meant that everything had to be well textured and scaled correctly, meaning that this game world is far more realistic and contains far more attention to detail than most video games of the time. To achieve this, they used photogrammetry, a very special form of technology that scans real-world objects and reproduces them as bespoke assets to use inside the game. Some of the monsters were even prototyped by makeup artists who covered themselves with raw and bloody meat to ensure that the body horror would be more realistic than anything ever seen before. In 2015, Capcom showed off a VR demo to the E3 attendees named KI7CHEN, without telling any of them that this was produced by the Resident Evil team. Perhaps it's a sign of the time that hardly any of the game journalists associated this new horror concept with Capcom's existing Resident Evil franchise, despite the number 7 being there front and focused in the demo title. Without much explanation save that this was a new concept game demo, the journalists were taken into a room, sat in a chair, given the headset and given a genuinely terrifying experience of being threatened at knife point. It was their screeching, heartfelt, terrified reactions that convinced Jun Takichi, head of Capcom's development division, to greenlight this as the way to go forwards with the project. The development team had been upset when they realised he was unable to physically play virtual reality games himself, so he couldn't experience what it meant. meaning that he would need some convincing. So rather than show him the demo, the team simply showed him a video footage of the players reacting to the game to make their point. Watching men and women shaking with fear, some of them nearly injuring themselves as they recoiled from the invisible threat they perceived advancing towards them, and the way word of mouth news of this demo spread between the E3 conference attendees gave the developers all of the confidence that they needed in order to plough forwards in their approach. The team spent another year working on the title before announcing Resident Evil 7 formally in 2016, with a planned 2017 release. The finished title was directed by Koshi Nakanishi, who had experience directing the well-regarded 3DS handheld spin-off Resident Evil Revelations, and the Japanese team even reached out to a Western writer, Richard Piercy, who had cut his teeth working on the Fear expansion packs to bring a very specific horror sensibility to the franchise. The team were all directed to watch the Evil Dead horror movies to base the tone and the feeling of the game around those films at all times. They wanted to put the horror first and foremost within the survival horror franchise again. Whether played using a virtual reality headset or a traditional console and television screen, this game played nothing like any of the previous Resident Evil games. It features a new protagonist, Ethan Winters, who, despite being faceless and rather light of personality, is fully voiced and personally involved in one of the tightest scripts the franchise has offered so far. There are essentially two important locations in Resident Evil 7, neither of them as large or in depth as the Spencer Mansion or the Raccoon Police Station from the original games in the franchise, but they do have plenty of depth to offer. One is the Baker household, a place you have to carefully explore whilst avoiding the householders who, one at a time, father, mother and then son, you have to confront. For a new player, this is a terrifying prospect, as the moulded creatures inhabiting the estate alongside the named family are incredibly intimidating in their own right, but for an experienced veteran, the whole game can be completed in well under 2 hours. Once Ethan escapes from the house alongside his wife Mia, whom the entire game plot revolves around, it relocates itself to a wrecked ship where the backstory that led to the infection and derangement of the Baker households is explained. The ship segment is controversial. Most fans of the franchise admire the Baker household as a return to form for the series, as, despite the mode of play being unique, it restores the gameplay loop of the original games. There is limited ammunition, scarce healing green herbs, and plenty of locked doors, with keys scattered throughout the building's labyrinthine corridors. Jack Baker represents a return of the Stalker enemy concept that Mr. X and Nemesis had offered back on the PlayStation 1, an enemy who cannot be fought but only avoided and hidden from. It's not him who makes the biggest impression, however, but the demented sight of your wife Mia turning on you at the very beginning of the game, as it subverts the damsel in distress trope by having the woman who summoned you to the household throw herself at the player with all of the fury of hell itself in a terrifying example of demonic possession. When, just over halfway through the game, you discover exactly who or what was behind all of this, the game changes. Once you reach the ship, the game travels back in time to before all of this began, and it shows Mia struggling to escape the bioweapon child Evelyn's initial surge to power. The game wants you to feel helpless. In the Baker household, this is achieved by a series of different techniques, but save for the roaming threat of Jack or Margaret, it was always possible to fight back. Difficult, intimidating, requiring both bravery and tactical planning certainly, but possible. On the ship, however, for long periods of time you have no weapon, no means of defending yourself, and you need to just hide and run. Worse, the game becomes cyclical as you revisit the same rooms and floors of the ship, first as Mia, then again 20 years later in the current day, slowly unlocking more secrets as you go. Then, from the ship, you escape through a fairly linear passage through the salt mines in an assault course against the moulded enemies before returning to the mansion to confront Evelyn one more time. I personally enjoyed the ship segments. As irritating as it was, it at least felt true to the survival horror theme of the game, but I was left unsatisfied by what follows. The salt mines were short and fairly simplistic, but worse, after reaching the ground after your underground journey, the game ends fairly abruptly, with an extremely disappointing boss fight to finish it off. The confrontations with Jack and Margaret have been heart-pounding, but both Lucas and Evelyn show a return to the spectacle-driven tendencies that the series had dabbled with on the last two games. I wish that the last few sections had opened up a bit more, giving you more to do save for the simple choice to either run past or gun down the lumbering beasts rising out of the earth in pursuit. Fortunately, the game has some further spice in the lost videotapes that allow you to replay or occasionally foreplay areas of the Baker household as previous lost doomed souls who were trapped and killed by the Bakers before Ethan arrived. This was a nice new addition to the franchise that pads out the games, but there are far fewer tapes in the final product than the concept promises. Some of these interesting concepts were scrapped and later fully developed and sold as downloadable experiences after the main game had released. The developers admitted that they had looked at other first-person horror games available, particularly Alien Isolation. But despite some of the initial comparisons to the stalwarts of the genre, such as Outlast and Amnesia, the similarities are pretty surface level. Often in those games, the focus is on running and hiding, and whilst that is a component of the Resident Evil games, their philosophy is not about stealth, it's about choosing your battles and acting decisively when the time comes. One oddity of the game is the overuse of the arm-based body horror. Given the first-person perspective, whilst playing, all you can see of Ethan are his forearms, meaning that much of the body horror comes from cutting or scraping of his hands and fists. They are bound and tied, cut, severed, scratched and burned throughout the game at every interval, to the point that it becomes almost comical how much Ethan can survive without consequence. Furthermore, whilst I admit that the American hillbilly trope is not very original, neither was the Haunted Mansion or the zombie invasion of the first two games. Resident Evil has always been at its weakest when trying to focus on developing original lore, and at its strongest when it focuses on making the player feel. And if it does that by revisiting and reimagining tired hackney old tropes, so much the better. The game became both a critical and a fan darling, and it was followed by 2 remakes of the old Resident Evil games using this new RE engine, although they adopted the over-the-shoulder style popularised by RE 4-6, before another first-person sequel would be released in 2021. Again, the franchise keeps splitting and changing, unable to hold to one consistent style. But I'd argue that despite the visual differences that make the RE2 remake and Resident Evil 7 look different, they share so much DNA that it is clear that they belong to the same franchise. And they prove that commercial success is possible if studios think long and hard about how a series can best represent itself and become its own ultimate iteration to build a reputation that will draw new fans in, rather than diluting an experience to trick people into playing games of a genre that they don't really care for. I'm not saying Resident Evil 6 was a bad game, it has its fans, but the development team were on record saying that they were tasked with attracting players who don't like survival horror games. Their goal was to dilute Resident Evil, to cut away the rough edges that may turn people off the series. But Resident Evil 7 is a kickback against that idea, one determined to put the horror and the survival aspects back at the front of the franchise. And this game itself is far from being perfect. Outside of the core family members of the Baker household, all of the
Tell and a roadie that